Drone operators from the 412th Nemesis Regiment of the Ukrainian Armed Forces unmanned systems destroyed 2 Russian Tor-M2 surface-to-air missile systems, a Buk M3 launcher, and the so-called Chupa-Chups, a radar station from the Buk M2 air defense system. The total value of the destroyed equipment is between $80 and $90 million. In the southern Slobozansky direction, reconnaissance and strike UAV groups from the Guard Border Brigade hit several enemy targets. Specifically, a Russian cannon, 2 vehicles, an ammunition depot, a Moramim long-range visual surveillance system, communication antennas, and a Russian drone launch site were destroyed. Pilots from the Signum Battalion shared the results of their combat operations over the past day on the Lyman section of the front. In particular, Ukrainian soldiers struck a Russian UAZ that was transporting occupiers across the central square of Kremina, and outside the city, operators caught up with and eliminated a Russian occupier on a motorcycle. Also, on the Lyman direction, the Russian army assaulted the positions of Ukrainian units near the settlements of Novomykhailivka, Druzhly-Lyubivka, Shandry-Holov, and Kaladayazy. On the Toretsk section of the front, the enemy carried out attacks in the areas of Sherbanivka, Katarinivka, Ruzinyar, and toward Poltavka. On the Pokrovsk front, the most intense sector, the Russian invaders tried to break through the Ukrainian defenses near the settlements of Vladimirovka, Nikanorovka, Novoekonomicheskaya, Myrolyubovka, Promin, and Novoukrainka.
2 strategic assaults are expected. This, of course, remains the Pokrovsk direction. And there, we are already carrying out multi-layered, unconventional actions, I should note. Right here, we switched to a model of operations that allows us to both defend specific lines, launch counterattacks, and liberate settlements. Yes, and the enemy is advancing in certain spots, but for almost a week now, we've been systematically liberating several villages or settlements in this sector. We're launching counterattacks from the flanks. It's very important that this new tactic has allowed us to act in ways that are unexpected for the enemy. They can't concentrate strike groups or build a defensive line. They're not used to this at all, to defending themselves systematically.
Since the beginning of 2025, Ukraine's defense forces have destroyed more than 305,000 Russian soldiers and nearly 30,000 pieces of enemy equipment. This was reported by the Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Oleksandr Syrsky. According to him, these numbers demonstrate the effectiveness of defensive actions and the high professionalism of the troops. At the same time, Ukrainian defenders are disrupting Russian logistics. For example, in 2025 alone, more than 29,000 units of enemy vehicles have already been destroyed. These figures indicate the systematic work of Ukrainian units to neutralize threats, Syrsky said, and he thanked the soldiers for their efforts.
The enemy has lost enormous resources. Over the entire period since the beginning of the year, that's 305,000. That's practically 30 armies. If you count the cadre but deployed ones, that's more than 15. So in this situation, we can say that the enemy's military resources, especially in terms of military units and trained personnel, are relatively limited. That's why they don't have the ability right now, from the very start of autumn, to launch new offensive operations.
And in the past 24 hours, Ukraine's defense forces have eliminated another 1,020 enemy soldiers. As a result, the total losses of the Russian army have exceeded 1,097,000 people. In addition, over the past day, Ukrainian defenders destroyed 5 tanks, 3 armored combat vehicles, 36 artillery systems, 2 multiple rocket launchers, as well as 108 units of enemy vehicles and special equipment.
We'll talk more about the situation at the front next. Joining us now is Malomuzh, General of the Ukrainian Army and head of the Foreign Intelligence Service of Ukraine from 2005 to 2010, who is now joining our broadcast. Welcome, Mykola Hrayvorovich, and glory to Ukraine.
Hello.
Great greetings. Glory to the heroes.
Mykola Hrayvorovich, right now we're talking about how, one way or another, the Pokrovsk direction remains, essentially, one of the main and most important for the Russian occupying army. But at the same time, let's define, the goals that the Russian army is pursuing in this direction, and not only here. If we say that they failed to achieve certain, let's say, results during the so-called summer offensive operation, what should we all expect, basically, in the autumn period, which, as we understand, will inevitably affect the course of hostilities, especially considering the changes in weather conditions?
Well, first of all, we have to state that the summer offensive operation failed. And as President Zelensky noted, the enemy had 3 strategic objectives. These were, of course, Pokrovsk and, generally speaking, the Donetsk agglomeration, then Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, and, naturally, an advance into the Dnipro region. And separately, there was also the plan to occupy, or at least encircle Sumy. So in fact, there weren't 3, but 8 objectives. That's why, at this point, the enemy has concentrated its forces along all these tactical directions, but hasn't managed to achieve a single one of their scenarios anywhere. Even the breakthrough in the Dobropilia direction, we managed to contain it, especially during the preparations for Putin's visit to the US, to Alaska. So even the military-political approach didn't work. That's why, at this point, we can state that the enemy has lost a tremendous amount of resources. Since the beginning of the year, that's 305,000. That's practically, well, 30 armies. If we're talking about such reduced but still deployed units, there are more than 15. So in this situation, we're saying that the enemy's military resources, especially in terms of military units, manpower, and trained divisions, are relatively limited. That's why right now, they don't have the ability to launch new offensive operations straight from the beginning of autumn. Today, Zelensky already noted that 2 strategic assaults are being planned. Of course, this still includes the Pokros direction, and there we're already carrying out complex, unconventional actions. As I want to point out, right here, we've switched to a model of operations that allows us to both defend specific lines, launch counterattacks, and liberate settlements. Yes, and the enemy is advancing in certain spots, but for almost a week now, we've been systematically liberating several villages or settlements in this sector. We're launching counterattacks from the flanks. It's very important that this new tactic has allowed us to act unexpectedly for the enemy. They can't concentrate strike groups or build a defensive line. They're not used to this at all, defending systematically. That's why the new elements in our operations are allowing us to achieve, for now, sectoral tactical results, but they're still significant. The enemy has already failed to implement the very tough plan that Putin had envisioned. This is the advance toward Kostyantynivka, the push from Toretsk, so to speak, now from the Yuyarsky direction, with the goal to occupy Kostyantynivka, to occupy Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. This has been Putin's main objective throughout the entire summer. And it's still the same now. This sector remains decisive. That's why new forces are being brought in. You see, there's a bit of a pause right now, yes, that's how things are going. But so far we haven't seen any systematic concentrations of troops, though they are being generated in the reserves. So this autumn offensive is precisely about generating new units of Russian troops. Yes, they're not very well trained, just barely, because a month of training is really not much. But the idea is that there will be a lot of them. More equipment is also being brought in. Some of it has been brought in from North Korea, partially. Not just rockets, as we know, ammunition, but also tanks, some self-propelled artillery, and already long-range artillery, the kind that will be used in the Donetsk sector. That's why right now we're preparing for such operations, and we'll be responding very actively. Well, right now they're carrying out tactical tasks. At the moment, they're looking for weak spots. This is also a very delicate situation for us, because, for example, breaking through to the Dnipro sector, entering certain villages, they're already announcing that the Dnipro sector is partially under their control. But in reality, it's just a few villages at the start. We push them out further, but they maneuver, trying to get in from the north or the south, just to be able to claim that the Dnipro region is already under their control, at least partially, even if it's just a few villages. This already becomes a factor both in negotiations and in pressure on us from our allies, who say that things aren't moving forward and that the other side is having success. And Trump is maneuvering as well. On one hand, he supports us and says Russia is aggressive, but on the other hand, he says we need to negotiate because the enemy still has offensive potential and is advancing. These are the kinds of factors that Russia is presenting to them through operational channels. Of course, on the Zaporizhia front, the enemy is now trying to form new forces. There are issues there, I'll be honest, on our side. We need to strengthen our groups because there are some not quite adequately supplied. I think the command is working on this now, because here we see Kamyansk, Tokmak, and other sectors as well. They were advancing by several hundred meters, even by kilometers. And of course, they're trying to find the seams, the weak spots. We've already understood this strategy of preparing new, sort of, offensive operations in September-October. That's why it's critically important to defend the Zaporizhzhia sector with all available means right now. First and foremost, with firepower and drones, primarily to destroy the reserves they're bringing up and, of course, the front line where they're trying to get closer to Zaporizhzhia so they can shell Zaporizhzhia with their standard military equipment, artillery, self-propelled guns, and other hardware. So in this situation, we see these kinds of preparatory actions, which suggest the beginning of this so-called autumn offensive season. Of course, there will be other sectors as well. Lyman is like the second, or rather, the third, diversionary stage, but the main idea is still to advance through the Kharkiv region, not only to secure a good foothold, but also because they believe there are no fortified areas further on, and they can move forward from there. On the one hand, it's about having an argument for negotiations right now that they control this particular sector in Kharkiv region, supposedly creating a buffer zone. But during the bargaining process, if we agree to withdraw from Donetsk region, they're ready to pull back there as well. So right now, there's a tough military struggle going on. And of course, a political one too. In the near future, given the situation at the front and the prospects of either our offensive or defense, negotiations will be underway and we'll be preparing our arguments. Serge was right. Right now, we're conducting active military operations along the entire front. The enemy hasn't managed to achieve any tactical, let alone strategic, successes anywhere. This will be the main factor in negotiations with Trump and other participants.
Grigorievich, thank you so much for going over the front lines in such detail. And if you didn't mention the north-northeast direction of the front, that means we can already say that not only have the Ukrainian armed forces stabilized the situation there, but we can also say that the defense forces have completely thwarted the Russian offensive on Sumy. I'd like to clarify this point. And how do you explain the presence of American military personnel as observers at the joint Russian-Belarusian military exercises, Zapad 2025? Does this mean that the situation from the north is no longer, let's say, unsafe for Ukraine?
Well, first and foremost, the Sumy sector. We saw that in the summer, Russia tried to advance and practically get close to Sumy. We neutralized a separate strategic operation. Then, literally a week and a half ago, there was a repeat attempt. They pulled their forces away from the Sumy direction and shifted them to Pokrovsk and Zaporizhzhia. But then the order came again to carry out a series of tactical operations, assuming that we had pulled our troops out of there. So they started launching attacks. They brought in airborne troops, Marines, several regular units, and began their strikes. But we were tracking all of this, the movement of their troops, and launched counterattacks. Our special forces scattered them, and now they're basically being pursued in various locations, including Zelenka. So there are no prospects for them there. Regarding the exercises, we assume that neither Russia nor, especially, Belarus, as Lukashenko said yesterday, that they're not attacking anyone and don't have the capability, would enter the war, because for Belarus, above all, it would mean the destruction of the regime itself. Because a strike will be delivered, and if they attack our state, especially NATO, then there will be counterstrikes, and that makes us and them direct targets. And the Belarusian army can't withstand that kind of pressure, and Russia won't save them, no matter how aggressive their statements may be. That's why the presence of American and other representatives, especially the Americans, demonstrated, sort of, a model showing that they are ready to monitor things according to the established rules. Wherever exercises are held, for example, if the CIS, CSTO, or NATO conducts them, representatives from other countries have the right to participate there. As I understand it, Trump carried out a tactical operation like this. He spoke with Lukashenko, agreed on participation, and in doing so, sent in the military to make sure that no provocations would succeed. Well, the very presence of American troops shows that they're on the ground, keeping the situation under control, and as a result, neither Belarus nor, even more so, Russia will have the opportunity to take such actions. I think this step is tactically the right one. Although many criticize that the Americans have come onto Belarusian territory as if they've recognized it, right now, it's important for us that no military operations start from Belarusian territory, and especially no strikes on our territory or on the territory of European Union countries, which are basically NATO countries. At this point, I suggest that there won't be any major tensions. Provocations, yes, there could be incidents, especially where Russia is forming its strike groups, including on the territory of NATO countries, Poland, the Baltics, Romania, and, accordingly, regarding Ukraine on the border with Belarus, there could be similar scenarios, with accusations either against representatives of NATO countries for creating a provocation or against Ukraine. But we already know about this. We're preparing, and both countermeasures and the military are potentially ready. On the information front, we're now working to make sure such provocations don't achieve their goals.
Subscribe to UATV English and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.